the aim of this paper is to present how, from a Kantian perspective, science and religion are not in opposition to each other and are not mutually exclusive. Of course, I'm speaking from my perspective. No? I'm going to give my personal interpretation of Kant. Rather, it is necessary to delineate the boundaries between them in order to clarify their relationship and their respective limits. The aim here is not to provide a detailed philological analysis, but rather to show how, on Kantian grounds, and even independently of the practical use of reason, which Kant addresses in the second critique, of course, one can address an issue that is often misunderstood in the general debate about scientism. The idea is that science provides not only an accurate picture of the world, but the only possible one, to the exclusion of all other perspectives, has indeed become almost commonplace and is part of today's worldview. The thesis presented here is that it is possible to understand and philosophically justify, from a Kantian perspective, why a religious view of the world can very well coexist with a scientific one. In order to achieve this objective, we shall briefly investigate the Kantian perspective and its differentiation between knowing, Erkennen, and thinking, Denken. If it is true that, according to Kant, knowledge is limited to experience, requiring the contribution of a sensible intuition, it is also true that it does not exhaust the sphere of rationality. The sphere of non-empirical noumenal objects, which can be purely thought of but not known, still falls within the domain of reason, even if not in that of scientific knowing. The separation of knowing and thinking allows the borders between the domain of science and that of metaphysics and faith to be established, thus ensuring that the limits and the domain of both are respected. If it is true that faith must not claim to make scientific statements on the physical world, example, it is also true that scientific knowing cannot make a totalizing claim to provide a definitive image of the world, which is outside its competence, because Erkennen scientific knowledge always concerns a local sphere of reality. This would be rather a matter for the metaphysical Denken. Consequently, in order to definitely eliminate any religious vision, it would be necessary for science to transcend its empirical and local domain and make such a totalizing metaphysical statement about reality as a totality. However, in doing so, science is no longer science and becomes problematic to itself. That was just a brief summary. Now, the distinction between knowing, Erkennen, and thinking, Denken, is a fundamental distinction made by Kant. This distinction can be linked to the systematic distinction within the theoretical part of Kant's thought between empirical experience, which is the domain of knowing, and metaphysics. The difference between knowing and mere thinking lies in the fact that, whereas the latter proceeds by simple concepts, the former requires not only concepts, but also sensible intuitions. While the object is merely thought through the concepts of the pure intellect, categories, it is only through the addition of a non-conceptual but intuitive component, Anschauung, that it is also given in proper knowledge, in proper scientific knowledge, you can say. This intuitive component refers not to the conditions of pure thought, but to those of sensibility, the pure forms of which are pain and space. It is certainly no coincidence that the place where this distinction is perhaps most explicitly expressed is at the beginning of paragraph 22 of the Critique of Pure Reason, that is, at the culmination of the transcendental deduction, where Kant attempts to justify the empirical use of categories, that is, their applicability to experience, in order to save them as meta-empirical structural elements of experience from empirics critique. It is well known that this fundamental methodological distinction made in the transcendental analytic underlies the critique of metaphysics made in the second part of the Critique of Pure Reason, that is, in the transcendental dialectic. Here, the three parts of traditional metaphysics, that is, rational psychology, the doctrine of the soul, rational cosmology, the doctrine of the world as a totality, and rational theology, the doctrine of God, are criticized insofar as they represent attempts by speculative reason to venture with its bare concepts far beyond the limits of possible experience. In other words, in these metaphysical adventures discussed in the transcendental dialectic, reason would attempt to overcome the condition imposed on it by the results of aesthetics and transcendental analytics, of always having to refer its pure concepts to a sensible intuition given space and time. The result of this effort would be, in vain, resolving itself in speculations that evade all scientific criteria of empirical verifiability. It is in this sense that Kant's criticism in the transcendental dialectic of the rational demonstration of meta-empirical objects such as the existence and immortality of the soul and the existence of God as a necessary being should be understood. Now, however, it is clear that, in addition to a clear negative result for religious thought, this also entails a positive result. The Kantian, as we shall see soon why. The Kantian analysis carried out in the transcendental analytic positively show the applicability of the categories of thought only to experience and, as a negative result, exposed in the dialectic, exclude the application of the categories outside experience. This work of cutting out and delimitation thus demarcates the limits of a possible science, the limits of which thus coincide with the scope of the possible application of pure concepts of thought to sensible experience. The negative moment here is that traditional metaphysical themes, including the existence of God, fall outside the sphere of science. But this result corresponds to only one of the possible perspectives, that of science. From another point of view, if this work of delimiting the domain of science leads to the negative result of excluding from it everything that lies outside it, it nevertheless opens up the positive result of recognizing that there is an entire dimension that lies outside this domain, even if it is not susceptible to scientific treatment in the strict sense. Here we come to the architectonic question of the relationship between reason and intellect. The sphere of science is that which is delimited by the intellect, or understanding, insofar as its concepts refer to sensible intuition. This is what Kant calls the land of truth, which he understands as an island surrounded by immutable borders. But the sphere of the intellect does not coincide with that of reason. Reason is broader precisely because it can think more than the intellect can know. It is precisely consistent by restricting scientific knowledge to the sphere of rationality, which is to that sphere of rationality which is the competence of the intellect, that allows and even demands a divergence and overflow of rationality beyond the limits of the intellect. The intellect includes that sphere of rationality which is the competence of scientific knowledge in the strict sense, but it is not the whole of rationality. It is a subset of it, so to speak. The separation of scientific knowledge through the intellect, with reference to sensible intuition, from the use of concepts outside the sphere, outside any possible reference to intuition, does indeed allow a boundary to be drawn between science and metaphysics. But this boundary is a boundary within rationality itself. Thus, we have Kant extending the notion of rationality far beyond scientific knowledge, to thinking, which, if it is not scientific in the strict sense, is not therefore completely irrational. This is the meaning of Kant's famous statement in the preface of the Critique that he had to suspend knowledge in order to make room for faith, which of course for Kant can only acquire its full meaning at the level of practical reason. It is in this perspective that we must read the well-known distinction between phenomenon and noumenal. If the phenomenon denotes that which appears in the restricted sphere of rationality with reference to the conditions of sensible intuition, and is therefore scientifically treatable, the noumenon denotes the purely thinkable, that which is not the object of purely scientific consideration, but can at least in principle be the object of rational thought. This Kantian framework seems to have at least two relevant consequences. To sum up, the first, as already mentioned, is the possibility of a clear distinction between the sphere of scientific knowledge and the sphere of non-scientific thought, which includes the religious sphere on the basis of the transcendental analysis of the structures of knowledge and pure reason. And the second, and for us more important consequence, is that the exclusion of the metaphysical sphere, which includes the religious domain, from the sphere of scientific knowledge in no way implies the recognition of its irrationality, since it is a sphere accessible to reason, although not to the restricted realm of the scientific intellect. The Kantian system, therefore, does not allow the possibility of a religious view of reality to be excluded. The latter is perfectly legitimate from the point of view of the principles and laws of reason, since it does not represent a formal analytical contradiction or violation of the principle of non-contradiction. Of course, the observance of formal analytical laws of thought and the principle of non-contradiction is only a necessary condition for the knowledge of something real, but not a sufficient one. Thus, considerations of the coherence of our statements concerning the religious sphere do not by themselves answer the truth of these statements, which requires other conditions in addition to the former ones. Nevertheless, it is already a remarkable achievement to admit that the domain of religious belief is at least not contradictory and not repugnant to reason, which certainly at least opens up the possibility of faith as a choice that is not irrational and therefore not to be equated with mere superstition. One could even say that, given this conclusion, it is an attempt to deny in principle the legitimacy of religious faith in the name of a purely scientific warfare that is not in line with reason. It is precisely the separation between knowing and thinking that demands the separation and division of tasks between the science of nature and the metaphysical religious consideration of the world. This is true in both senses. On the one hand, reason, which surpasses the scientific intellect in its quest for the totality of reality, has nothing to say about those questions which concern science and which do not involve the inclusion of the particular phenomena under investigation in an ultimate context. From this point of view, if this were to happen, it would be as if reason were trying to lead the scientific intellect beyond its limit, which are those drawn by experience. This would be a result that would violate the architectonic division of the cognitive faculties with their peculiar functions, as outlined by Kant, and would therefore be an irrational result. This is what would happen, for example, if one wanted to read Genesis as if it was a scientific text, the purpose of which would be to give an account in competition with ordinary science of the development of the universe or of living beings, etc., which is clearly not the aim of the author of a text such as Genesis. On the other hand, a no less irrational and unacceptable result would occur from the Kantian perspective if the scientific intellect tried to prove by its own means the fundamental illegitimacy of any religious view of the world. In this case, the intellect would in fact be going far beyond the limits of experience. And just as in the first case, religion awkwardly pretended to be science, in the present case, the scientific intellect would be pretending to be what it is not, namely a faculty capable of resolving metaphysical questions, thus going beyond the limits of experience. And that's why Kant maintain something like the thing in itself. In fact, the distinction between metaphysical religious reasoning and scientific reasoning is based on the fact that the former is totalizing and makes statements that concern the totality as a whole, which is why it cannot decide anything about particular phenomena, which is the task of science. Scientific reasoning, on the other hand, always has a local field of action, never global and totalizing, and therefore always refers to groups of phenomena belonging to a part, to a region of being, and never has anything to do with being as a whole. Now it becomes clearer why, in the context of Kantian thought, it is impossible to affirm the illegitimacy of a religious view from a scientific point of view. Science deals only with local parts of being that are the object of experience, for example in space and time. To deny the possibility of a different view is to abandon this limitation to make a thesis, which would not be scientific but metaphysical, about the totality of the world. Such an attitude, which might be close to scientism, seems contradictory in itself because while it pretends to be scientific, it proceeds in a way that cannot be scientific. In fact, affirming the illegitimacy even of a possible religious view of things is only possible for the scientist if she leaves the local domain of research on a limited crop of phenomena in order to make a statement that concerns reality as a totality, as a whole. To rule out the possibility that there is something outside what can be ascertained through scientific experience is ultimately only possible by first looking inside the scientific experience, which leads the scientist beyond the limits of his scientific work, and second, observing that there is nothing else in this outside, making a global thesis about reality as a whole in order to provide a definitive picture of the world. However, reality as a totality, the world as a whole, is not a scientific object, but an object of that metaphysics which Kant criticizes in the Transcendental Dialectic, in which reasons...
5 more minutes.
Okay. In which reason, in attempting to deal with the world as a totality, necessarily runs into antinomies. This non-scientific but metaphysical outcome renders any such attempt to impose a scientistic vision contradictory. The paradox then is that in order to eliminate the legitimacy of any religious or metaphysical vision in the broadest sense, scientific thought would have to adopt a metaphysical or even, in a certain sense, a religious thesis, becoming no less problematic than that religion or metaphysics is sought to eliminate. This result could be confirmed by a consideration which here must necessarily be limited to a mere indication of those systems in the history of thought which, like the Kantian system, which is an open system, do not even leave room for the possibility of absolute transcendence, and therefore are closed systems. This is the case, for example, of Spinoza's system or that of Hegel, in which there is an evacuation of any beyond, a reduction of all transcendence to the immanent sphere. It is not coincidence, however, that such a project is only possible at the cost of very problematic metaphysical assumptions and ontological commitments, as in the case of Spinoza, the assumption of an absolute substance, or the assumption of that thought is so powerful that it coincides with the totality of reality, leaving nothing real outside itself. Ultimately, however, such assumptions appear as postulates that resist any strictly scientific consideration, can only be accepted, so to speak, as an act of faith. I would stop here. Thank you for attention.
Thank you for your talk. Just a short one. How do you save Kant himself from this, let's say, description of being of having a scientific attitude? Because it seems to me that a lot of his philosophy hinges on the demarcation between phenomena and noumenon, and then it seems like he falls into the scientific camp. Thank you.
Very briefly, so the very fact that it left the possibility open that we can thought about phenomena, that's I think that's a demonstration that Kant is not in scientist, that it falls not in the scientific field, so to speak, because leaving the possibility that you can have another perspective, a noumenal perspective on things, that opens up the possibility of another consideration about reality, whereas the scientific vision would state that everything you can say that you can make meaningful statements about is treatable by science, which is not the case by Kant, because you know there is a domain of reason, which is the practical reason, where the scientific intellect is cannot do anything. So, but you need reason in order to address topics like the good, the mortality of the soul, God, and so on.
Okay, now Steve.
I want to pick up on something that you introduced early on about this distinction between science and faith, knowing and thinking, and that was that the boundary between them is immutable. Okay, so the immutability of the boundary. Now, in the 19th century, right, there were people who were claiming to be following Kant precisely on this point, actually were very reluctant to admit that a lot of the entities that were being generated by mathematics, so we talk about non-natural numbers, non-Euclidean geometry, all this kind of stuff is being developed in the 19th century, and it leads to an enormous amount of controversy that goes on till the end of the century, right? Because basically you're getting people saying these things that these mathematicians are coming up with are just, you know, realms of the imagination, right? They belong, you know, they're not really science, right? And mathematics is not going to remain scientific if people are just proliferating all these entities. And so they were trying to shut it down, you might say, kind of on the grounds that you're talking about, right? That there's an immutable boundary, and if you're doing science, you do it this way. You don't go into these realms of reason, pure reason, and all that. Nevertheless, it turns out in the 20th century, right, that all of these, you know, many, if not most of these mathematical entities that seem so exotic and in a way defined they defied Kant's own view of space and time, right? They sort of defied that. Nevertheless turn out to be very instrumental in the development of all kinds of things, right? So, you know, the revolutions in physics and logic, right, being, you know, sort of the main cases. And so this historically made Kant look kind of bad, right? It looked like Kant in some way was retarding the advancement of science because, you know, he seemed to be putting too strict a boundary between knowing and thinking. And if you look at the neo-Kantians in the late 19th and early 20th century, they're always having to backpedal for Kant. They always have to provide all kinds of apologies for Kant because they're not, that's not really sort of the framework that's going to get you to the cutting edge science that was happening then. And so I'm just wondering what your response to this is, because you don't actually say in your talk that you endorse this, right? You're sort of presenting it as an exposition, but do you endorse it in the strong form of there being an immutable boundary between knowing and thinking?
No, of course not. Of course not. Well, I agree with everything you said. That's a big question. Of course, we have to put Kant into an historical perspective, and I'm not going to say that that this account is should be accepted as as the best account we can have about science, of the distinction between science and what is not science, and everything of that. But yeah, of course, if you look at the non-Kantians, people like Nator, Cassirer, Cohen, those people will want to reactivate the Kantian inheritance, so to speak. They had to make lots of changes to the Kantian system in order to make the Kantian system good for the new situation of knowledge. After the revolutions of the non-Euclidean geometries, after quantum physics and theory of relativity, I refer to the writings of Cassirer about which are illuminating. Well, you're right. I just wanted to give a little historical account about Kant. About the Kant of 1881 or 87 and not. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Giulio, once again for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.